I killed Fidel. I first stumbled into the world of Fidel Castro voodoo dolls back in the 80s when I met an old man who sold minutos out of a garage in Little Havana. A minuto is a piece of battered fried fish served on Cuban bread, slathered with mayonnaise and wrapped in wax paper. His kitchen consisted of a barrel of sizzling oil, an industrial-sized jar of mayonnaise, and several loaves of bread stacked against the wall. The old man looked like he had been battered and fried a few times himself. He adjusted the can of sterno under the oil and looked up. "Buenos," I said. "Un minuto, por favor." He nodded and unwrapped a piece of breaded fish and dropped it into the drum of boiling oil with his bare hands. I reconsidered my order and looked around. That's when I noticed a dusty old doll with the image of Fidel Castro painted on one side. Long rusty pins protruded from Fidel's eyes, heart, and groin. I pointed to the voodoo doll. "¿Qué es that?" I asked him. He eyed me suspiciously and didn't answer. "You want to know?" he asked me. "Yeah, why not?" He tapped the side of his blotchy head. "Knowledge dangerous," he said. I shrugged. He looked at the voodoo doll and back at me and came to a decision. As he scooped the fish out of the old grease and prepared my minuto, he told me the most incredible story. And even though his English was badly broken, and I speak Spanish like a dim-witted toddler, I got the gist of it. Castro, when he took power, outlawed the Santeria churches. Many Santero priests were arrested and executed. But a cabal of powerful women priestesses, the Santeras, met in secret and developed a plan to take down Fidel Castro. They did not have weapons or armies at their disposal, but they knew how to sew. They called their group the Instituto de Liberación Voodoo, the Voodoo Liberation Institute, and attempted to put thousands of Fidel Castro voodoo dolls into the hands of their followers. They believed that if enough voodoo dolls were put into enough hands of enough people, it would break the spiritual force field that allowed Fidel Castro to stay alive, in spite of repeated assassination attempts. The dolls were hand-cut using strips of fabric from stolen military uniforms. The image of Fidel Castro was painted on them, using black ink derived from the abundant coastal squid. Finally, a Santeria ritual was performed in the dead of night for each and every voodoo doll. Hundreds were fabricated by candlelight in small homes and apartments, hidden from husbands and children and cousins. Unfortunately, someone blabbed. The military came. People were arrested. Most of the voodoo dolls were rounded up and thrown into a bonfire. Only a couple were smuggled to Miami. He picked up the voodoo doll and brushed off the dust. "Mierda," he said, and held it over the drum of boiling oil. He swung it back and forth, as if considering whether to release it in some final desperate attack against the man who ruined his life. I reached over and moved his hand away from the boiling oil. I had a great idea. "Todavía no," I told him. "Not yet. I will carry on the mission. Castro is as good as muerte." I could easily manufacture and distribute hundreds of Fidel Castro voodoo dolls myself. Thousands. I would destroy Fidel Castro and make a few bucks in the process. It seemed like a good idea at the time. My first act was to officially reestablish the Instituto de Liberación Voodoo, which was surprisingly easy. Then I printed a caricature of Fidel Castro on some rough fabric, enough for 100 dolls. All I had to do was cut them to size, stuff them with cotton, and sew them up. But first I had to sell them. So I placed an advertisement in Replica, a popular Miami Cuban magazine. Translated into English, it read, "Liberate Cuba through the power of voodoo." Imagine the power of voodoo increased many times over by innumerable believers against Fidel Castro. The Institute of Voodoo Liberation is dedicated to defeat Fidel Castro through the use of voodoo dolls made in his image. Only these voodoo dolls are specially designed to function effectively against the communist dictator. You can help by requesting your doll right now. The more dolls that are distributed, the stronger their spell will be. Pins and special instructions are included. I've priced the dolls at $12.95 each, and opened up a special P.O. Box, 450702, to receive the money. At the same time, I sent a press release to the Miami Herald. I explained that the Voodoo Liberation Institute was a, quote, movement that combines the supernatural with the political on a mass scale to bring about the destruction of Fidel Castro and his communist regime. I suggested on the anniversary of the Communist Revolution, quote, we would all plunge a needle into the heart of Fidel Castro at exactly the same time, which would certainly cause his heart to burst from his hairy chest, end quote. I went on to say that, again, quote, the supernatural power generated by so many people in unison against one person had never before been attempted in the history of the world. I am certain that this spiritual assassination will bring a swift end to the dictator. A few orders dribbled in. I cashed the checks. I got my Cuban wife to sew up a few dolls and sent them out with pins and instructions. I was hoping that Castro would stay alive long enough so I could sell some more dolls. Then I received 2 letters from the Alpha 66 Brigade, a terrorist group known for committing violence against pro-Castro sympathizers. The first letter indicated they wanted to buy 3 dolls and pick them up personally. It went on to say, quote, please add a penis to the voodoo doll and stick it up your ass and keep it there until I show up. From time to time, give a little twist with Fidel in your butt. Why don't you all learn to live like decent people? Sincerely, the sodomite from New Jersey. It turned out the second letter from Alpha 66 was not as polite as the first one. They threatened to kill me and my family if I didn't immediately cease and desist. I was baffled. I was certainly not pro-Castro. I was trying to kill him with the power of voodoo. They should be buying my dolls, not threatening my life. But apparently they found the whole thing to be insulting. They wrote, quote, the Cuban people are not that stupid. Now, I don't know if they were the real Alpha 66 Brigade, or an angry Cuban, or someone who was selling their own Fidel Castro voodoo dolls and wanted to eliminate the competition. But my wife was terrified. We had a newborn in the house. She wanted me to drop the whole Voodoo Liberation Institute gig and put away the remaining dolls and fabric. And the less people who know, the better, she warned me. I had to agree. That's when the angry Cuban reporter from the Miami Herald showed up at the Jefferson Arms apartment in Miami Lakes, where I worked as the assistant department manager. She demanded to interview me. Her first question was, do you realize how insulting your voodoo doll is to the Cuban people in Miami and Cuba? I answered honestly, no, it didn't cross my mind. I thought it was funny. She was outraged. Funny? Do you think that the suffering of the Cuban people is funny? Aren't you just a money-hungry con artist looking to make a buck off the suffering of the Cuban people? Well, when you put it that way, I answered, but what if it works? What if Fidel Castro dies in some bizarre voodoo accident? The Cuban community will declare me a saint and put little statuettes of me in glass boxes on their front lawns. The Miami Herald reporter just looked at me with an expression of disbelief. Nobody ordered any, I lied, so it's not a big deal, not worth writing about, no story here. The article that came out in the local section of the Miami Herald a few days later was less than flattering. The Cuban people would not be fooled, it said. The Cuban people were not that stupid. Fortunately, a few of them were. Orders came in, and I dutifully mailed out the dolls, but I lost money in the whole deal, like all of my crazy money-making schemes. That was a long time ago. But when Fidel finally died in 2016, I tried to claim the credit. My wife didn't buy it. Your voodoo dolls certainly took a long time, she said. What did they do, give him a fatal hangnail? But the fact is, Fidel Castro is dead. Was it due to the voodoo dolls? I like to think they played a part, and nobody can prove me wrong.